Imagine waking up one morning with a high fever. You walk into a nearby medical store. Within minutes, the pharmacist hands you a strip of tablets. You swallow one, drink a glass of water, and carry on with your day. It feels ordinary. In fact, it feels so ordinary that most of us never stop to ask a fascinating question. Where did that medicine actually come from? Not the shop, not the hospital, not even the pharmaceutical company whose name is printed on the box. Long before that medicine reached your hands, it had traveled through an invisible industrial network involving chemical factories, research laboratories, manufacturing plants, regulatory agencies, export ports, quality inspectors, logistics providers, wholesalers, distributors, and finally, retailers. Every tablet has a story. And hidden somewhere inside that story are companies that almost nobody outside the investment community has ever heard of. Today's story is about one such company. But before we meet it, we need to understand why this story is becoming increasingly important, not just for investors, but for India itself. Because sometimes a company's future is shaped not by what it does today, but by the direction in which an entire nation is moving. And over the last few years, India has quietly begun moving in a direction that could redefine its pharmaceutical industry for decades. Think back to the COVID-19 pandemic. The world suddenly realized something uncomfortable. Countries capable of designing medicines were not always the countries capable of manufacturing their ingredients. Supply chains froze. Factories shut down. Ships remained stranded. Governments discovered that producing medicines was only half the battle. The real challenge was securing the basic chemical ingredients needed to make them. This changed the conversation globally. Healthcare was no longer viewed as just another business sector. It became an issue of national security. Food security protects a country's stomach. Energy security protects its economy. But pharmaceutical security protects its people. And no nation wants to depend entirely on another country for life-saving medicines. That realization reshaped industrial policy across the world. India was already known as the pharmacy of the world. It supplied affordable medicines to more than 200 countries. Indian pharmaceutical companies were manufacturing everything from antibiotics to cancer drugs, diabetes medicines, cardiovascular treatments, psychiatric therapies, and vaccines. But there was one uncomfortable truth hidden beneath this success. Many Indian pharmaceutical companies depended heavily on imported active pharmaceutical ingredients, commonly known as APIs. If medicines are like cakes, APIs are the flour. You can own the bakery. You can hire the best chefs. You can have beautiful packaging. But if the flour never arrives, nothing gets baked. The entire system stops. That dependency became painfully obvious during the pandemic. And when governments recognize strategic vulnerabilities, they usually respond with policy. India did exactly that. The government of India began encouraging domestic manufacturing through initiatives such as production-linked incentive, PLI, schemes, support for bulk drug parks, and broader efforts under Make in India and Atmanirbhar Bharat. The objective was straightforward: strengthen domestic capabilities in pharmaceutical manufacturing and reduce critical import dependence over time. Notice something interesting. Government policy rarely changes overnight. But when it does, industries begin changing years before investors fully appreciate the impact. History is filled with such examples. When India invested heavily in information technology, IT companies flourished. When telecom reforms gathered pace, telecom companies transformed. When digital payments accelerated, financial technology exploded. Policies do not guarantee winners, but they often determine where opportunities begin. This is one of the first mental models every investor should understand. Policy creates the playing field. Companies decide whether they become winners. Now imagine you're an entrepreneur deciding where to build a business. Would you rather build in an industry facing declining demand, or in one where government policy, demographics, rising incomes, healthcare awareness, and exports are all pushing in the same direction. Most investors instinctively chase companies. Professional investors often begin by studying industries, because great companies rarely emerge from permanently declining industries. Instead, they usually emerge where powerful economic currents are already flowing. Think of sailing. A skilled sailor matters. But sailing with the wind is easier than sailing against it. This is why investors often talk about tailwinds and headwinds. A tailwind doesn't guarantee victory, but it makes progress easier. A headwind doesn't guarantee failure, but it demands exceptional execution. Before judging any company, experienced investors first ask a simple question. Which way is the wind blowing? Fortunately for India's pharmaceutical industry, several powerful winds are blowing in the same direction. The world's population is aging. People are living longer. Lifestyle diseases like diabetes, hypertension, obesity, cardiovascular disorders, and chronic illnesses continue to rise. Healthcare spending is increasing across both developed and developing economies. Emerging markets are expanding healthcare access. Governments continue investing in public health infrastructure. Meanwhile, multinational pharmaceutical companies increasingly diversify supply chains beyond single-country dependence. This trend is often described as China plus one. The idea is simple. Instead of relying overwhelmingly on one manufacturing location, global buyers spread sourcing across multiple countries. India naturally becomes one of the strongest alternatives. Again, this does not automatically benefit every pharmaceutical company, but it enlarges the opportunity available to well-managed businesses. Imagine opening a restaurant in a city whose population doubles over the next decade. You are not guaranteed success, but your chances improve compared with opening the same restaurant in a shrinking town. That is the difference between company analysis and industry analysis. The industry determines how large the opportunity can become. Management determines how much of that opportunity the company captures. Now let us zoom in further. When people hear the word pharmaceutical company, they often imagine scientists discovering miracle drugs. Reality is much more layered. The pharmaceutical ecosystem resembles an enormous manufacturing pyramid. At one end are research-driven innovators spending billions discovering new molecules. Further down are companies manufacturing ingredients. Further still are businesses converting those ingredients into finished medicines. Then come branding, distribution, hospitals, pharmacies, and finally patients. Every layer creates value. Every layer earns profits differently. Some businesses win through innovation, others through manufacturing excellence, others through regulatory compliance, others through scale, and others through distribution. Understanding where a company sits in this value chain is one of the most important steps in understanding its economics, because every layer faces different risks, different margins, different competition, and different opportunities. This brings us to the company at the center of today's story, Wanbury Ltd. If you had asked investors about Wanbury several years ago, many would probably have dismissed it as another struggling small pharmaceutical company. Losses, debt, weak balance sheet, limited market attention. Certainly not the kind of company dominating television debates. Certainly not a market favorite. And yet, businesses, like people, have chapters. Some spend years struggling before discovering a new direction. Some enjoy early success before gradually fading away. The stock market has a special name for companies attempting to rewrite their destiny. They are called turnaround stories. But here's an important lesson. Not every struggling company becomes a turnaround. Many remain permanently broken. Some disappear altogether. Others survive but never truly recover. So the real question is never, is this company making profits today? The real question is, has something fundamentally changed? Because markets are forward-looking. They don't reward yesterday. They reward tomorrow. This introduces another powerful mental model. Imagine driving a car. When you look through the windshield, you are looking ahead. When you glance at the rearview mirror, you are looking behind. Financial statements are like the rearview mirror. They tell you where the business has been. The stock market, however, spends most of its time staring through the windshield. It constantly asks, where's this company going next? This is why share prices often rise before profits explode. And sometimes they fall long before profits begin declining. Markets discount the future, not the present. That simple idea explains much of what appears confusing about investing. Over the next hour, we are not merely going to examine financial numbers. We are going to investigate a business. We will understand where Wanbury fits within India's pharmaceutical value chain. We will explore why government policy may matter. We will examine the industry's tailwinds and headwinds. We will trace the company's difficult past, its emerging turnaround, its management decisions, its financial transformation, and the opportunities and risks that lie ahead. Along the way, we will also learn how experienced investors think. Not because memorizing ratios creates wealth, but because developing the right questions often does. And perhaps the most important question we will repeatedly return to is this: is Wanbury simply experiencing a temporary improvement? Or are we witnessing the early chapters of a genuine transformation? That is the mystery. And like every good mystery, the clues are already hidden in plain sight. In the next chapter, we leave the world of policy and enter the pharmaceutical factory itself. Before we can understand Wanbury, we first need to understand the invisible business that powers almost every medicine we consume and where exactly Wanbury stands in that value chain. The invisible factory behind every medicine. At these medicines, they all seem like finished products. But in reality, what you are holding in your hand is the final chapter of a story that began months earlier, perhaps even years earlier, inside a chemical reactor in a factory hundreds or thousands of kilometers away. Most people assume pharmaceutical companies simply make medicines. But that is a little like saying a car company simply makes cars. Think about a car for a moment. A car manufacturer doesn't mine iron ore. It doesn't refine crude oil into plastic. It doesn't manufacture every electronic chip. Instead, an enormous ecosystem works together. Mining companies extract metals. Steel companies convert ore into steel. Component manufacturers produce engines, brakes, tires, and electronics. Only after all those parts come together does the automobile company assemble the finished vehicle. Medicines work exactly the same way. There is an invisible industrial ecosystem operating behind every tablet you consume. And unless we understand that ecosystem, we cannot understand Wanbury. Let's imagine we are building a medicine from scratch. The journey begins not in a pharmacy, but inside a chemical manufacturing facility. Scientists identify the molecule responsible for treating a disease. That molecule becomes the heart of the medicine. The pharmaceutical world calls this the active pharmaceutical ingredient, or API. The easiest way to understand an API is through a simple mental model. Imagine making a cup of tea. You may use different cups, different brands of milk, different sugar, different packaging, different tea bags. But the tea leaves themselves create the flavor. Without tea leaves, there is no tea. Similarly, without the active pharmaceutical ingredient, there is no medicine. Everything else is simply helping that ingredient reach the patient safely. This is why APIs are often called the engine of a medicine. They perform the actual therapeutic work. Everything surrounding them simply supports that function. Now imagine building a house. The cement gives the building strength. But cement alone cannot become a house. You need bricks, steel, electric wiring, paint, doors, windows, labor, architecture. Medicines also require supporting ingredients. These inactive ingredients are known as excipients. They help tablets dissolve correctly, improve taste, increase shelf life, control absorption, protect the medicine during transport. Although patients rarely notice them, these ingredients determine whether the medicine actually performs as intended. Only after combining APIs with these supporting materials does a pharmaceutical company produce the tablets, capsules, syrups, or injections that eventually appear in pharmacies. This creates two broad kinds of pharmaceutical businesses. The first group specializes in making APIs. These companies rarely advertise to patients. Most consumers never recognize their names. Their customers are usually other pharmaceutical companies. Think of them as industrial suppliers. The second group specializes in branded medicines or formulations. These companies manufacture the finished products doctors prescribe. Their brands become familiar to hospitals, pharmacies, and patients. This distinction is incredibly important because these two businesses earn money in very different ways. An API manufacturer succeeds through chemistry, manufacturing efficiency, quality systems, regulatory approvals, and scale. A formulation company succeeds through branding, distribution networks, doctor relationships, product portfolio, and marketing. Some companies focus on only one layer. Others operate across multiple layers. Wanbury belongs to this second category. It is not merely an API manufacturer, nor is it only a branded formulation company. It participates in both businesses. That seemingly small detail changes the economics of the company dramatically. Think of a wheat farmer. One farmer grows wheat and sells it. Another farmer owns a flour mill. A third owns both the farm and the flour mill. Who has greater flexibility? The third. If wheat prices fluctuate, he has more options. If flour demand rises, he captures more value. Owning multiple stages of the value chain often provides resilience. Wanbury follows a somewhat similar philosophy within pharmaceuticals. It manufactures active pharmaceutical ingredients while also producing finished formulations for domestic markets. This creates diversification. If one segment faces temporary pressure, the other may partially offset it. Of course, managing two businesses is also more complicated. Operational complexity increases. Capital requirements rise. Execution becomes more demanding. Diversification is not automatically an advantage. Only disciplined execution transforms diversification into a competitive strength. Now let's travel inside one of Wanbury's manufacturing plants. At first glance, it doesn't resemble the futuristic laboratories often shown in movies. Instead, you'll find massive stainless steel reactors, pipelines weaving through buildings, quality control laboratories, highly trained chemists, protective equipment, strict documentation. Every batch follows standardized processes. Every temperature matters. Every reaction matters. Every measurement matters. Because pharmaceutical manufacturing is unlike most manufacturing industries. If a shirt develops a small defect, customers may still buy it. If a chair develops a scratch, people may ignore it. But medicines leave almost no room for error. One quality failure can destroy years of reputation. This explains why pharmaceutical companies invest heavily in compliance. And this is where another important concept enters our story. Regulation. Suppose you want to export medicines to developed countries. Producing a quality product is not enough. You must convince regulators that your factory consistently produces quality products. That is why inspections by agencies such as the USFDA, MHRA, EMA, and other regulators become so important. These inspections are more than bureaucratic exercises. They represent trust. Imagine applying for a driving license. Passing the driving test does not guarantee you will never have an accident, but it demonstrates that you meet minimum standards. Similarly, regulatory approvals do not guarantee commercial success, but without them, many international opportunities simply remain closed. Wanbury operates manufacturing facilities approved by major regulators, and its recent clearance of the Korean MFDS inspection with zero observations reinforces confidence in its manufacturing standards. That may sound like a technical detail, but in pharmaceuticals, clean inspections often translate into credibility with global customers. Now let's ask another question. Who actually buys Wanbury's products? Unlike consumer brands that advertise directly to households, Wanbury operates largely behind the scenes. Its API customers are often other pharmaceutical manufacturers. Its formulation business reaches doctors, hospitals, distributors, and pharmacies across India. In other words, Wanbury is not selling fashion. It is supplying an essential healthcare ecosystem that creates a different kind of demand. People rarely postpone treatment for chronic diseases simply because economic conditions weaken. Healthcare demand tends to remain relatively resilient. But that doesn't mean pharmaceutical companies are immune to business cycles. Competition increases. Raw material prices fluctuate. Regulatory expectations become stricter. Currency movements influence exports. Governments negotiate medicine prices. Working capital stretches. Each challenge tests management quality. This is why pharmaceutical investing requires balancing optimism with realism. Here is another mental model professional investors often use. Imagine an iceberg. Above the water, everyone sees revenue, profits, share prices, quarterly earnings. Those are visible. But beneath the water lies the much larger structure. Manufacturing quality, supply chain reliability, research capability, relationships with customers, regulatory compliance, capital allocation, employee culture, operational discipline. These invisible factors eventually determine whether visible financial numbers improve or deteriorate. Markets often focus on the visible iceberg. Long-term investors spend more time studying what lies beneath. Wanbury's recent financial improvement becomes far more meaningful when viewed alongside improvements in manufacturing execution and operational credibility, rather than as isolated profit numbers. At this point, you may wonder, if pharmaceutical manufacturing is such a good business, why doesn't every company become hugely successful? That question takes us to another important lesson. Not every industry participant captures equal value. Think about airlines. Passenger traffic may increase every year, yet many airlines struggle financially. Meanwhile, aircraft manufacturers, airport operators, or booking platforms sometimes earn superior returns. Growing industries do not automatically produce great investments. Execution determines who captures value. Exactly the same principle applies in pharmaceuticals. A large opportunity creates possibility. Management converts possibility into reality. That distinction separates average companies from exceptional ones. This brings us back to Wanbury. The company occupies an interesting position within India's pharmaceutical ecosystem. It is neither a tiny niche laboratory nor a global pharmaceutical giant. Instead, it sits in a segment where operational excellence, manufacturing capability, export relationships, and capital discipline matter enormously. Its business model allows it to participate in both ingredient manufacturing and finished formulations. That creates opportunity. It also creates responsibility, because investors are no longer evaluating a single product. They are evaluating an entire operating system. And that operating system has already lived through both success and failure. Which raises a fascinating question. If the opportunity in pharmaceuticals has existed for years, why did Wanbury spend so much of its history struggling? What went wrong? Why did investors lose confidence? And perhaps more importantly, what changed? Because every turnaround story has two halves. The first explains why the company fell. The second explains why it may rise again. Only by understanding both can we decide whether this is a genuine transformation or merely a temporary recovery. In the next chapter, we leave the factory floor and step into the broader pharmaceutical battlefield. We will explore the powerful tailwinds pushing India's healthcare industry forward, the hidden headwinds threatening profitability, and why these forces matter so much for Wanbury's future. The psychology of a turnaround, why the stock market often misses the biggest opportunities. Imagine you are standing outside an old house. The paint is peeling. The windows are broken. The garden is overgrown. The roof looks tired. Neighbors walk past every day without even looking at it. To most people, it is simply an abandoned building. Now imagine an experienced real estate investor standing beside you. He isn't looking at the broken windows. He isn't looking at the faded paint. He's asking completely different questions. Who owns this land? Is the location improving? Can this building be renovated? Will a new highway come nearby? What will this place look like 5 years from now? Suddenly, both of you are looking at the same house. But you are seeing two completely different realities. One sees decay. The other sees optionality. That single difference separates an ordinary observer from an investor. And nowhere is this difference more important than in turnaround investing. Because a turnaround story is never obvious. If it were obvious, the opportunity would already be gone. This brings us to one of the biggest misconceptions in investing. Many people believe that the stock market rewards companies with the best past performance. But history tells us something very different. The market doesn't reward the past. It rewards changing expectations. Think about this carefully. Suppose company A earns 1,000 crore rupees every year. Everyone already expects it to continue doing so. Now suppose next year it earns exactly 1,000 crore again. Has anything changed? Not really. The company performed well, but it merely met expectations. Now imagine company B. For years it struggled. Losses, debt, weak margins. Investors almost stopped paying attention. Then suddenly, it reports its first meaningful profit. Has it become a better business than company A? Perhaps not. But something much more important has happened. Expectations have changed. And in the stock market, changes in expectations often matter more than absolute numbers. Let's understand this using cricket. Imagine Virat Kohli walks onto the field. Everyone expects him to score 50. If he scores 52, people nod politely. It was expected. Now imagine a young domestic player making his debut. Nobody expects anything. If he scores 70, the headlines belong to him. Not because 70 is greater than 52, but because the difference between expectation and reality was enormous. Markets think exactly the same way. They constantly compare reality with expectations, not reality with perfection. This is the first mental model. Is this company becoming better than the market currently believes? That tiny change in wording changes everything. Because investing is not an examination. It is a prediction market. Now let's bring this idea to Wanbury. For many years, the company was not considered exciting. It had periods of losses. Its balance sheet carried stress. Debt remained high. Margins were weak. Investor confidence gradually disappeared. Many institutions simply moved on. Analysts stopped writing about it. Television discussions ignored it. Retail investors looked elsewhere. The market quietly formed a story. Nothing interesting happens here. Now pause for a moment. Stories are incredibly powerful. Humans understand the world through stories. Not spreadsheets. Not ratios. Stories. And once a story becomes widely accepted, people stop questioning it. Imagine your school teacher once called you an average student. Even if your performance improved later, many people would continue thinking of you as average. Not because they dislike you, but because human brains dislike updating beliefs. Psychologists call this confirmation bias. We naturally search for evidence supporting what we already believe. If we think a company is bad, we notice every negative headline. If we think a company is excellent, we forgive every mistake. The facts remain identical. Our interpretation changes. Markets suffer from exactly the same psychological weakness. Charlie Munger often spoke about this. Another is social proof. Imagine walking through two restaurants. One is completely empty. The other has customers waiting outside, without knowing anything about the food. Which restaurant feels safer? Most people choose the crowded one. Not because they know the food is better, because other people seem to think so. Stock markets behave similarly. Investors feel comfortable buying what everyone already owns. It feels safer. Ironically, that is often when future returns become smaller. He believed the human brain contains predictable tendencies that repeatedly distort judgment. Confirmation bias is one of them. Another is social proof. Imagine walking through two restaurants. One is completely empty. The other has customers waiting outside, without knowing anything about the food. Which restaurant feels safer? Most people choose the crowded one. Not because they know the food is better, because other people seem to think so. Stock markets behave similarly. Investors feel comfortable buying what everyone already owns. It feels safer. Ironically, that is often when future returns become smaller. Now imagine the opposite. A stock nobody discusses. Few institutions own it. Financial television ignores it. Analysts rarely publish reports. Buying such a company feels uncomfortable. Not because the business is necessarily bad, but because humans fear standing alone. Howard Marks describes this beautifully. He says successful investing is uncomfortable by nature. If an investment feels completely comfortable, there is a good chance thousands of others have already discovered it. And if everyone already agrees, where will the surprise come from? This leads us to another fascinating mental model. Second-level thinking. Most investors think, profits increased. Buy the stock. Second-level thinkers ask, everyone already knows profits increased. Has the market already priced that in? Oh, profits haven't improved yet, but early signs suggest they may improve over the next few years. Has the market missed that? This idea comes from Howard Marks. He calls it second-level thinking. First-level thinking is obvious. Second-level thinking asks, what is everyone else missing? That doesn't guarantee success, but it changes the quality of questions. Now let's introduce another powerful concept, George Soros and reflexivity. At first, reflexivity sounds like a complicated academic word. It really isn't. Imagine a bank deciding whether to lend money. If a company's share price keeps falling, banks become nervous. They may reduce lending. The company now faces higher financial pressure. Investors see the pressure. The share price falls further. Notice what happened. The falling price created conditions that justified an even lower price. The perception changed reality. Now imagine the opposite. Profits improve. The share price rises. Banks become more willing to lend. Suppliers offer better credit terms. Employees feel optimistic. Customers gain confidence. Management raises capital more easily. Those improvements strengthen the business. The stronger business justifies the higher valuation. Again, perception changed reality. This feedback loop is called reflexivity. Markets don't merely observe businesses. Sometimes they actively influence businesses. Turnaround stories often become powerful examples of reflexivity. When confidence returns, everything becomes easier. Hiring, financing, expansion, customer trust, institutional ownership, media attention, even employee morale. This is why management teams often say, momentum matters. They're not only talking about business momentum. They're talking about psychological momentum. Now let us examine Wanbury through this lens. Recent financial performance suggests meaningful operational improvement. Profits have increased significantly. Margins have expanded. The balance sheet has strengthened. Equity has grown. Manufacturing quality continues improving. None of these alone prove permanent success. But together, they begin changing the narrative. The question investors now ask is no longer, can this company survive? It slowly becomes, can this company sustain this improvement? Notice the difference. The business may not have changed overnight. The question investors ask certainly has. And questions determine valuations. This brings us to another mental model from Charlie Munger. Inversion. Instead of asking, why might Wanbury become successful? Let's ask the opposite. What could prevent the turnaround? Immediately several answers appear. Working capital, debt, execution, competition, regulatory issues, pricing pressure, promoter behavior. Now something interesting happens. Instead of becoming emotionally attached to the story, we become intellectually honest. Munger believed inversion helps investors avoid foolish mistakes before chasing extraordinary returns. Sometimes avoiding disaster matters more than finding brilliance. Now imagine climbing a mountain. Halfway to the summit, the hardest part has already been completed. But the journey is still dangerous. Many climbers celebrate too early. The same happens with turnaround companies. The first phase is survival. The second phase is recovery. The third phase is consistency. And the fourth phase, only the rarest companies achieve. They become compounders. This is where patience becomes more important than excitement. Markets often celebrate the first signs of recovery. Long-term wealth is created only if recovery becomes sustainable. That distinction separates temporary rebounds from enduring businesses. So where does Wanbury stand today? Not at the beginning, not at the end. Somewhere in the middle. The company appears to have crossed the most difficult stage of survival. Its recent financial performance reflects improving operations. Revenue, profitability, margins, and shareholders' equity have strengthened meaningfully over the past year, while the audit opinion remains unmodified. But recovery is only the opening act. The real challenge now begins. Can management convert improved profitability into durable cash flows? Can debt continue falling? Can export opportunities expand? Can operational discipline remain intact when growth accelerates? Because markets eventually stop rewarding hope. They begin rewarding consistency. And perhaps that is the greatest lesson of every turnaround story. The numbers rarely change first. The story changes first. Then expectations. Then behavior. Then capital flows. Finally, the numbers catch up. Most investors notice the last chapter. Exceptional investors spend their lives trying to recognize the first. As we close this chapter, imagine watching a movie where the hero has finally escaped the valley. The audience cheers. But experienced climbers know something important. The climb has only just begun. Wanbury's story has reached exactly that point. The company has given investors reasons to look again. But looking again is not the same as believing. Belief must be earned, quarter after quarter, year after year. And that raises perhaps the most important question of this entire documentary. If Wanbury truly is changing, what exactly inside the business has changed? Because stories inspire us. But businesses are built by economics. And economics always leaves evidence. In the next chapter, we become financial detectives. We will step inside Wanbury's financial statements not to memorize ratios, but to uncover the hidden clues that reveal whether this turnaround is merely cosmetic or fundamentally real. How financial statements reveal a turnaround long before headlines do. Imagine you have been called to investigate an old mansion. From outside, it looks magnificent. Fresh paint, beautiful lights, perfect landscaping. Visitors admire it. Neighbors praise it. Everything appears wonderful. But a seasoned structural engineer doesn't begin by looking at the paint. He walks into the basement. He checks the foundation. He examines the pillars. He studies the cracks hidden behind furniture. Because he knows one timeless truth. Appearances can be renovated overnight. Foundations cannot. Businesses are remarkably similar. The share price is like the paint. The financial statements are the foundation. And if you truly want to understand whether a turnaround is real, you have to stop looking at the walls and start examining the pillars holding the entire structure together. That is exactly what we are about to do. Not as accountants, not as auditors, but as detectives. Whenever investors open an annual report for the first time, they often make the same mistake. They immediately jump to profit, revenue, earnings per share, maybe even the shareholding pattern. Professional investors do something different. They ask one simple question. Where did the improvement actually come from? Because profits can improve for many reasons. Some are permanent, some are temporary, some are genuine, some are accounting. And unless we separate them, we may misunderstand the entire story. Let's begin with the simplest question. Has Wanbury's business actually become larger? The answer appears to be yes. Revenue has increased from roughly 600 crore rupees to around 650 crore rupees over the last financial year. Now, some people may look at this and say, only 8 or 9% growth? That's not extraordinary. And they would be right. But here's where investing becomes interesting. Imagine you own a small restaurant. Last year, you served 100 customers every day. This year, you serve only 108. At first glance, nothing dramatic has happened. But now imagine that your kitchen has become much more efficient. Food waste has fallen. Electricity costs are lower. Your chefs work faster. Customers spend a little more. Suddenly, your profits double. Did the restaurant become twice as busy? No. It simply became much better at converting sales into earnings. That is exactly what appears to be happening at Wanbury. This introduces one of the most important concepts in business: operating leverage. The phrase sounds complicated. The idea is beautifully simple. Imagine a cinema hall. Whether 10 people come to watch a movie or 100, many costs remain exactly the same. The projector still runs. The building still needs electricity. Employees still report to work. Once those fixed costs are covered, every additional ticket sold contributes much more to profit. Businesses work in a similar way. When fixed costs are already paid, even modest growth in revenue can create disproportionately larger growth in profits. That is called operating leverage. And it is one of the most beautiful forces in business. Not because it always exists, but because when it appears, it often surprises investors. Wanbury's recent financial performance reflects this effect. Revenue increased steadily, but operating profit expanded far more rapidly. Now let us look one layer deeper. Margins. Most investors celebrate higher profits. Few ask why margins improved. Imagine two grocery stores. Both sell 100 packets of rice. One earns 5 rupees per packet. The other earns 15. Who has the stronger business? Obviously the second. Margins tell us how efficiently management converts revenue into profit. Think of margins as the amount of water remaining in a bucket after every leak has been plugged. The fewer leaks, the more water reaches the destination. Wanbury's operating margins have expanded meaningfully over recent years. That tells us something important. Either the company has become more efficient, or it is selling a more profitable product mix, or both. Whatever the reason, margin expansion rarely happens by accident. It usually reflects better execution. Now let's ask a slightly harder question. If profits have increased, where did those profits go? This question separates investors from speculators. Imagine your salary doubles. Wonderful. But suppose you also double your spending, increase your loans, buy expensive gadgets, take on new liabilities. Has your financial position actually improved? Maybe. Maybe not. Exactly the same principle applies to companies. Profits alone don't create wealth. What management does with those profits matters even more. This brings us to the balance sheet. Many investors fear balance sheets because they appear complicated. Let's simplify them forever. That improves some aspects of the balance sheet, but also creates refinancing pressure if working capital is not managed carefully. This tells us something important. The turnaround is real, but it is not complete. Now we arrive at what Warren Buffett famously calls the most important number in business. Not earnings, not revenue, cash. Imagine selling vegetables in a market. At sunset, you have sold everything. Customers congratulate you. Your notebook shows record sales. But nobody has actually paid. Everyone promises, "I'll give you the money next month." Are you rich? Of course not. You have profits. But you don't have cash. Businesses fail this way more often than people realize. Accounting profits can look wonderful. Cash shortages can still destroy the company. That is why professional investors eventually end up spending enormous amounts of time studying one document that retail investors almost ignore: the cash flow statement. Think of the cash flow statement as a medical ECG. The income statement tells us whether the patient looks healthy. The balance sheet tells us the patient's physical condition. The cash flow statement tells us whether the heart is actually beating. Wanbury continues to generate positive operating cash flow, which is encouraging because the core business is producing cash. At the same time, significant capital expenditure and investments have resulted in large cash outflows, while year-end cash balances remain relatively modest. This creates an important nuance. The business is healthier, but it is also investing heavily. That investment must eventually produce higher returns. Otherwise, today's optimism becomes tomorrow's disappointment. Now let's discuss one of the most misunderstood concepts in finance: working capital. Whenever investors hear those words, many immediately lose interest. That is unfortunate, because working capital quietly decides the fate of thousands of companies. Imagine running a furniture business. Customers order a dining table today. You buy wood, pay workers, purchase polish, arrange transport, deliver the furniture. But the customer says, "I'll pay you after 3 months." Until that money arrives, your cash remains trapped. As businesses grow, they often need more money simply to finance growth itself. Wanbury's receivables and inventories have increased with expansion. This does not automatically indicate poor quality, but it does mean management must convert growth into collections efficiently. Otherwise, profitable growth can become cash-intensive growth. This is why seasoned investors say, revenue is vanity, profit is sanity, cash is reality. Now let's revisit something we discussed earlier: government policy, China plus one, healthcare demand, export opportunities. All these tailwinds create opportunity. But financial statements answer a different question. Is management actually converting opportunity into economics? That is where Wanbury becomes interesting. The company isn't merely talking about exports. It continues strengthening manufacturing capabilities and maintaining regulatory credibility, including recent international inspection success. It isn't merely talking about profitability. Margins have expanded. It isn't merely talking about growth. The balance sheet has strengthened. But it is also reminding investors that every turnaround carries unfinished work: debt, working capital, cash generation. These chapters are still being written. Imagine watching a young tree after the first monsoon. Fresh green leaves appear. The trunk looks stronger. The branches begin expanding. Would you immediately conclude that the tree will survive for the next 50 years? Probably not, because one healthy season doesn't guarantee a healthy forest. But it certainly tells you something important. The tree is alive. That is exactly where Wanbury appears to stand today. The financial statements suggest that the business is no longer fighting merely for survival. It is attempting to build durability. Whether it succeeds depends not on one year's profit, but on whether today's improvements become tomorrow's habit. And perhaps that is the greatest lesson hidden inside every balance sheet. Numbers don't tell stories. They leave clues. The investor's job is not to memorize those clues. It is to connect them. Because somewhere between revenue, margins, cash flows, debt, and management decisions lies the real character of a business. And every great investment begins not with finding perfect numbers, but with learning how to read imperfect ones. As we leave this chapter, another question naturally emerges. We've examined the business. We've examined the psychology. We've examined the financial evidence. But one mystery remains. How much is this business actually worth? Because a wonderful company can still become a terrible investment if you pay the wrong price. And surprisingly, the answer is not found in a single valuation ratio. It is found by looking at the business through multiple lenses. In the next chapter, we step into the world of valuation, not as mathematicians, but as business owners. We'll explore every major valuation framework, from price to earnings and PEG to discounted cash flow, enterprise value, Graham's margin of safety, and replacement cost, using simple stories and mental models to understand what Wanbury might truly be worth. Reading the crowd. Why charts don't predict the future. They reveal human nature. Imagine you are standing on the terrace of a 20-story building overlooking one of India's busiest railway stations. Thousands of people are moving. Some are running. Some are waiting. Some are entering. Some are leaving. At first glance, it looks like complete chaos. But now imagine standing there for an hour. Gradually, patterns begin to emerge. You notice that every morning people move in one direction. Every evening, the flow reverses. Certain platforms remain crowded. Others remain quiet. Nothing magical happened. The crowd was never random. You simply learned to observe. The stock market works in exactly the same way. Every day, millions of decisions are made. Someone buys. Someone sells. Someone panics. Someone becomes greedy. Someone books profits. Someone starts accumulating quietly. Someone exits silently. When all these decisions combine, they create one thing, a stock chart. Most people think charts predict the future. That is perhaps the biggest misunderstanding in investing. Charts don't predict. Charts record. They are simply the visual history of human behavior. And because human behavior changes slowly, patterns often repeat. Not because lines have magical powers, but because human emotions haven't changed for thousands of years. Imagine walking into a vegetable market. At 6 a.m., vegetables are fresh. Supply is abundant. Customers negotiate. By noon, the best vegetables are already sold. By evening, whatever remains is discounted. Nobody needs technical analysis to understand what happened. Demand met supply. The same invisible force drives every financial market on earth. Not indicators, not algorithms, not television experts. Demand and supply. Every chart is nothing more than a picture of demand meeting supply over time. Now let us ask a simple question. Why does the price of a stock rise? Many people answer, because the company is good. That sounds logical. But it isn't completely true. A company's quality and its share price are related, yet they are not identical. Imagine a beautiful house. If nobody wants to buy it, its price won't rise. Now imagine an ordinary apartment in a rapidly developing locality. 10 families want it. Only one apartment exists. Its price increases. Notice something interesting. The building didn't change. Demand changed. Markets behave exactly the same way. Prices move because buyers and sellers continuously negotiate value. This introduces one of the oldest mental models in economics, the auction market. Imagine an auction. A rare painting is placed on the stage. The auctioneer begins. One bidder offers 10 lakh. Another offers 12. Then 15. Then 20. The painting itself remains exactly the same. Only people's willingness to pay changes. The stock market is simply the world's largest continuous auction. Every second, every day, every year, the auction never stops. When we look at a chart, we are not looking at a machine. We are watching an auction. Now think about Wanbury. For many years, very few investors wanted to own it. Not because medicines disappeared, not because pharmaceutical demand collapsed, but because confidence disappeared. Remember what we discussed in the previous chapter. Markets don't price only businesses. They price beliefs. When belief weakens, buyers disappear. When belief returns, buyers slowly reappear. Long before newspapers write, this company has transformed. The auction quietly begins changing. Prices stop falling. Selling pressure reduces. Buying gradually increases. This is not prediction. This is observation. Imagine rainfall after a long summer. The first drops don't create rivers. They simply wet the ground. Gradually, small streams appear, then ponds. Eventually, the river begins flowing. Institutional buying often behaves similarly. Large investors cannot purchase millions of shares in one afternoon. If they try, the price itself runs away from them. Instead, they accumulate patiently, quietly, week after week, month after month. To an ordinary observer, nothing seems to happen. To someone studying market behavior, the river has already begun flowing. This explains another important principle. Price often moves before news. At first, this sounds impossible. How can prices move before the news? The answer is surprisingly simple. Imagine your neighbor owns a restaurant. You visit every week. One day, you notice something unusual. Customers are waiting outside. The staff seems busier. Food quality has improved. The owner has hired more employees. Now imagine the local newspaper writes 6 months later. Popular restaurant sees record growth. Did the restaurant improve because of the newspaper? Of course not. Reality changed first. The newspaper simply reported it later. Financial markets often behave similarly. Business conditions improve. Customers notice. Suppliers notice. Employees notice. Distributors notice. Institutional investors begin noticing. Only much later, television discussions begin. The chart doesn't predict the news. It often reflects improving reality before headlines catch up. Now let us discuss something that confuses many beginners. People often believe technical analysis and fundamental analysis are enemies, almost like two rival religions. In reality, they are describing the same elephant from different sides. Imagine meeting a doctor. One doctor checks your blood reports. Another performs an ECG. A third orders an MRI. Would you ask, which doctor is correct? No. Each is studying the same patient differently. Fundamental analysis studies the business. Technical analysis studies the market's reaction to the business. One asks, how healthy is the company? The other asks, how healthy is investor confidence? Both matter because businesses create value. Markets recognize value, sometimes immediately, sometimes years later. Charlie Munger often warned against becoming trapped inside one mental model. He called it the man with a hammer syndrome. If all you own is a hammer, every problem looks like a nail. The same mistake happens in investing. Some investors only study financial statements. Others only study charts. The best investors combine multiple lenses. Think about driving a car. The windshield tells you where you're going. The rearview mirror tells you where you've been. Side mirrors reveal hidden risks. Would you drive using only one mirror? Of course not. Successful investing requires multiple perspectives. Imagine stretching a rubber band. Eventually, it becomes extremely tight. Release it. It snaps back. Markets behave similarly. Sometimes optimism becomes excessive. Sometimes pessimism becomes excessive. Neither lasts forever. Turnaround companies often spend years under extreme pessimism. Then reality improves. The rubber band slowly begins moving the opposite direction. Not because markets suddenly become intelligent, because expectations had become too negative. This is why experienced investors constantly ask, what expectations are already reflected in today's price? Not, is this company perfect? Another fascinating lesson comes from behavioral economics. Humans suffer from something called loss aversion. Psychologists Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky demonstrated that people experience the pain of losing money much more intensely than the pleasure of gaining the same amount. Imagine losing 10,000 rupees. Now imagine finding 10,000 rupees. The emotional intensity is not equal. Loss hurts more. This explains why many investors sell great businesses after temporary corrections, while refusing to sell permanently broken businesses. They hope losses somehow disappear. Turnaround investing requires the opposite mindset. You must separate the business from your emotions. Study evidence. Not fear. Study probabilities. Not headlines. Now imagine standing beside a river. You throw a stone into the water. Ripples spread outward. Eventually, the river becomes calm again. Markets are full of ripples. Quarterly earnings, interest rates, political events, global crisis, currency movements. Professional investors don't chase every ripple. They study the river itself. The river represents the long-term economics of the business. Ripples represent temporary noise. Wanbury's long-term story will ultimately depend far more on sustained execution than on short-term market fluctuations. Chapter 10. The mirror every investor must face. Wanbury may not be the biggest question. You are. Documentary voiceover, approximately 10 to 12 minutes. Imagine walking into a clothing store. On one side, there's a perfectly tailored business suit. On the other, a beautifully designed trekking jacket. Both are expensive. Both are high quality. Both are made from premium materials. Now imagine asking the salesman, which one is better? He smiles, then asks a question in return. Better. For whom? If you are climbing the Himalayas, the business suit is useless. If you are attending a board meeting, the trekking jacket makes little sense. Neither product is good. Neither product is bad. Everything depends on who is using it. This is one of the greatest lessons in investing. People spend years trying to understand companies, while spending almost no time understanding themselves. And yet, the biggest reason investors fail isn't because they buy bad companies. It's because they buy companies that don't match their own temperament. Before asking, is Wanbury a good stock? Perhaps we should ask a more important question. For whom? Imagine entering a marathon. Around you stand thousands of runners. Some want to finish in 2 hours. Some simply hope to complete the race. Some are professional athletes. Others are running their very first marathon. Now imagine giving everyone exactly the same training plan. Would it work? Of course not. Different runners require different strategies. Investing is exactly the same. There isn't one correct investment style. There are many. The mistake begins when we borrow someone else's strategy, without borrowing their temperament. Let's begin with the first personality, the speculator. Imagine someone standing outside a casino. He isn't interested in businesses. He isn't interested in industries. He wants excitement, fast decisions, quick outcomes, immediate feedback. Tomorrow's price matters more than next year's profits. There is nothing inherently immoral about speculation. Every market needs participants willing to take risk. But speculation and investing are not the same activity. One asks, where will the price go? The other asks, where will the business go? Confusing the two creates enormous frustration. Wanbury's story is not built around overnight excitement. It is built around gradual business improvement that naturally attracts a different mindset. Now imagine another personality, the swing investor. This investor understands something important. Markets move in waves. Business performance improves in stages. Investor confidence changes gradually. He is not trying to own a company forever, nor is he trying to predict tomorrow morning. Instead, he attempts to participate in meaningful portions of larger business trends. Notice something interesting. Even a swing investor benefits enormously from understanding fundamentals, because market psychology becomes much stronger when supported by improving business economics. A company reporting stronger profitability, healthier operations, and improving execution often provides a stronger foundation for positive market sentiment than one driven only by rumors. Wanbury's recent financial performance reflects this improving operational backdrop. Now let us meet perhaps the most patient investor, the value investor. Imagine visiting an antique market. Hundreds of old items lie scattered everywhere. Most visitors see junk. One experienced collect quietly notices a rare antique hidden beneath dust. He doesn't buy because everyone else is buying. He buys because his estimate of value differs from the market's estimate. That is value investing. Benjamin Graham often reminded investors that the market behaves like a voting machine in the short term and a weighing machine in the long term. Think about that. A popularity contest eventually becomes a measurement contest. Value investors love this idea because they understand something remarkable. Popularity changes quickly. Business value changes much more slowly. For them, Wanbury's story isn't merely about higher profits. It is about whether the market still underestimates the durability of those profits. Now imagine someone even more specialized. The turnaround investor. This investor is unlike everyone else. He spends very little time studying already successful businesses. Instead, he searches for companies standing exactly where Wanbury appears to stand today. Businesses that have survived their darkest period, but have not yet fully regained market confidence. Turnaround investors know something fascinating. The biggest gains rarely occur when businesses become perfect. They often occur when businesses stop becoming wars. That tiny shift changes everything. Imagine a patient recovering in a hospital. The doctor doesn't celebrate because the patient won a marathon. He celebrates because the patient no longer requires life support. Recovery begins long before complete health returns. Turnaround investing works similarly. The first meaningful improvement often matters more than the first perfect year. But here lies the danger. Turnaround investing attracts many people because the rewards can be extraordinary. Unfortunately, so can the mistakes. For every successful turnaround, many companies never recover. This is why experienced turnaround investors become almost obsessive about evidence. Not hope, evidence. They repeatedly ask, what has actually changed? Margins? Cash flows? Management behavior? Debt? Manufacturing quality? Capital allocation? The story must continuously earn their confidence. Now let us meet another personality. The growth investor. Imagine planting a mango sapling. The first few years, very little fruit appears. Some neighbors laugh. Nothing is happening. Then gradually, the tree grows. Branches expand. Harvests become larger every year. Growth investors think similarly. They willingly pay for tomorrow's potential, provided that potential continues expanding. For them, the key question isn't, how much does Wanbury earn today? It becomes, how large can Wanbury become if management keeps executing well? Now imagine the income investor. This investor thinks completely differently. He wants regular cash returns, stable dividends, predictable income. Imagine buying an apartment primarily for rental income. Capital appreciation becomes secondary. Monthly cash flow matters most. For this personality, Wanbury may not yet be the ideal fit. Why? Because management is currently prioritizing reinvestment and business strengthening over meaningful dividend distribution. Notice something important. That doesn't make Wanbury bad. It simply means it may not align with this investor's objective. Again, better for whom? Now let us introduce one of Charlie Munger's most important ideas. Circle of competence. Imagine your doctor suddenly begins giving legal advice. Would you trust him? Probably not. Now imagine your lawyer performing heart surgery. Impossible. Every expert operates inside a circle. The smartest people know where that circle ends. Investing works exactly the same way. Some investors deeply understand pharmaceuticals. They know APIs, USFDA inspections, manufacturing economics, regulatory pathways. Others understand banking. Some understand technology. No one understands everything. Munger believed extraordinary investing doesn't require understanding every company. It requires honestly recognizing which companies fall inside your own circle of competence. Wanbury may be an excellent opportunity, but only if you understand businesses like it. Humility becomes a competitive advantage. Now let us discuss patience. Imagine planting a banyan tree. Every morning, you dig it out of the soil to check whether the roots are growing. What happens? The tree dies. Many investors unknowingly do the same thing. They buy a company, check the share price every 15 minutes, read every headline, react to every rumor. Businesses cannot compound under constant emotional interference. Patience is not inactivity. Patience is allowing good decisions enough time to produce results. This brings us to Warren Buffett's favorite analogy. He often compares the stock market to baseball, but with one extraordinary difference. In baseball, the umpire forces you to swing 3 missed pitches, and you are out. In investing, no one forces you to act. Thousands of opportunities pass every year. You may ignore 99 of them. Wait patiently. Then invest only when one opportunity truly fits your understanding. That freedom is perhaps the greatest advantage individual investors possess over professionals. Professionals often feel pressure to remain invested. Individuals can simply wait. Now imagine standing before a mirror. The mirror asks no questions. It simply reflects reality. Stocks behave similarly. They often reveal more about investors than investors reveal about stocks. Some panic easily. Some become greedy. Some chase excitement. Some seek certainty when none exists. Some cannot tolerate temporary declines. Others become emotionally attached to stories. The company remains the same. Different investors experience completely different journeys. Because investing is never only about the company. It is also about the person holding the shares. So, where does Wanbury fit? If you're looking for a perfectly mature, low-risk pharmaceutical giant with decades of uninterrupted stability, Wanbury probably isn't that story. If you are searching for a company that has already completed its turnaround, again, perhaps not. But if you are interested in businesses that appear to have moved from survival toward recovery, then Wanbury naturally enters the conversation. Not as certainty, as possibility. And investing has always rewarded those who understand the difference. As we reach the end of this chapter, one final realization emerges. We've explored the policy, the industry, the value chain, the psychology, the financial statements, the valuation, the management, the market, and finally, ourselves. Only one question now remains, the biggest one of all. What is the final verdict? Not, should you buy? Markets are far too complex for such simplistic answers. Instead, how should an intelligent investor think about Wanbury after understanding everything we've learned together? Because the purpose of this documentary was never to give you an answer. It was to teach you how to ask better questions. In the final chapter, we will bring every thread together: government policy, industry economics, management quality, valuation, psychology, and probability into one unified conclusion. Not a recommendation, but a framework for thinking. Because the greatest investment you make is not in a stock. It is in the quality of your own thinking. The last question isn't about Wanbury. It's about how you think. From a turnaround story to an investing philosophy. Imagine it is a Sunday afternoon. You are sitting with your grandfather. In front of both of you are two saplings. One is already 3 feet tall. Strong, green, healthy. Strong, green, healthy. The other is much smaller. Its stem looks thin. Its leaves are fewer. Your grandfather smiles and asks, which one will become the bigger tree? You immediately point toward the larger one. It feels obvious. Then he quietly replies, the bigger tree today isn't always the bigger tree tomorrow. He points toward the smaller sapling. Sometimes this one grows faster. Sometimes the bigger one stops growing. Sometimes both survive. Sometimes neither survives. The future belongs to the one that keeps growing. That is investing. And perhaps that is the best way to understand Wanbury. Throughout this journey, we never tried to answer whether Wanbury is a good stock. Because that is the wrong question. Instead, we asked a series of much better questions. Why does the pharmaceutical industry exist? Where does Wanbury sit in the value chain? How do APIs quietly power medicines consumed across the world? Why did government policy suddenly become important? Why does China plus one matter? Why does an aging population matter? Why do margins matter more than headlines? Why does management matter more than machinery? Why does psychology often move prices before fundamentals become obvious? And perhaps the most important question, why though turnaround stories create so much disagreement among intelligent investors? Let's step back one final time. Imagine watching a movie from the very beginning. In the first scene, the hero appears ordinary, weak, ignored. Nobody believes in him. If someone walked into the theater after the final scene, they would think success was inevitable. But those who watched from the beginning know something different. Success never looked inevitable. It looked uncertain. Turnaround investing feels exactly like that. Looking backwards, every successful turnaround appears obvious. Looking forward, almost none of them do. That uncertainty is precisely where opportunity hides. Think about Wanbury's journey. Several years ago, investors weren't discussing expansion. They were discussing survival. The conversation has changed. Today, the company has demonstrated improving profitability. Operating performance has strengthened. Margins have expanded. Shareholders' equity has recovered substantially. Manufacturing capability continues improving. International regulatory credibility has strengthened. The financial statements no longer resemble those of a company simply trying to stay alive. That is not opinion. That is evidence. But investing doesn't end with evidence. It begins there. Now imagine building a bridge across a river. Half the bridge has already been completed. Concrete pillars stand firmly. Workers continue laying steel beams. Would you confidently drive a truck across it? No. Would you conclude the bridge will never be completed? Again. No. Wanbury appears to be standing on that bridge. The hardest engineering work may already have happened. The final destination has not yet been reached. That distinction matters enormously. Remember the first chapter. Government policy. PLI. API self-reliance. China plus one. Healthcare security. Those forces still exist. The wind continues blowing. Remember the second chapter. The pharmaceutical value chain. Wanbury doesn't merely sell medicines. It occupies a strategic position inside a manufacturing ecosystem that supports medicines reaching millions of patients. Remember the third chapter. Tailwinds. Headwinds. Healthcare demand continues expanding. Yet competition, pricing pressure, regulation, working capital, and execution remain constant companions. No company escapes them. Remember the fourth chapter. Psychology. Markets don't reward perfection. They reward changing expectations. The greatest mistake investors make is assuming that yesterday's reputation determines tomorrow's opportunity. Sometimes, the market continues punishing a company long after the business itself has started recovering. Sometimes, the market continues celebrating a company long after its business has quietly begun deteriorating. The share price tells you what people believe. The financial statements tell you what the business is doing. The intelligent investor constantly compares the two. Remember the fifth chapter. The financial statements. We weren't searching for perfect numbers. We were searching for evidence of changing economics. Higher profitability. Healthier operating margins. Stronger shareholders' equity. Positive operating cash generation. Continued investment into manufacturing capability. Those clues suggested something important. The turnaround appears operational, not merely cosmetic. But every detective also noticed unfinished work. Working capital, debt, cash balances, execution. The story remains incomplete. Remember valuation. No single model gave us the answer. Price to earnings, PEG, enterprise value, discounted cash flow, book value, replacement cost, reverse DCF. Every model showed us one side of the mountain. Together, they reminded us of one timeless principle. Price and value are never the same thing. Sometimes markets ask too much, sometimes too little. The investor's lifelong challenge is recognizing the difference before everyone else does. Remember technical analysis. We deliberately avoided magical thinking. Charts don't predict the future. They reveal behavior. They show how thousands of investors are gradually changing their opinions. Fundamentals explain the business. Technical observations explain the crowd. Neither is complete without the other. Remember management. Factories don't allocate capital. People do. The greatest manufacturing plant in the world cannot compensate for poor capital allocation. Likewise, ordinary factories managed exceptionally well can create extraordinary shareholder wealth. The most encouraging aspect of Wanbury's recent journey isn't simply that profits improved. It's that multiple parts of the organization appear to be moving in the same direction. Manufacturing, operations, financial performance, regulatory execution, capital strengthening. These pieces are beginning to align. That is how genuine turnarounds usually begin. Then we imagined the futures. The bull case, the bear case. Neither was fantasy. Neither was certainty. Because investing has never been about predicting one future. It has always been about assigning probabilities to many futures. This is perhaps the biggest difference between investing and gambling. Gamblers seek certainty. Investors seek probability. Probability, reflexivity, second-level thinking, margin of safety, circle of competence. Not because any one model gives the answer, but because together, they reduce the probability of making foolish decisions. And sometimes, avoiding foolish decisions creates more wealth than making brilliant ones. Now imagine meeting Warren Buffett for 5 minutes. Suppose you ask him, Mr. Buffett, is Wanbury a buy? He probably wouldn't answer. Instead, he might ask you questions. Do you understand the business? Can you explain where it earns money? What risks concern you most? How durable is its competitive advantage? What assumptions are already reflected in today's valuation? Would you still own this business if the stock market closed for 5 years? Notice something fascinating. None of those questions mention today's stock price. Because intelligent investing has never started with price. It starts with understanding. And perhaps, that is the greatest lesson Wanbury offers us. This story isn't really about one pharmaceutical company. It is about transformation, about how businesses evolve, about how markets slowly change their minds, about how management decisions accumulate over years before becoming visible in financial statements, about how patient investors learn to recognize improving businesses before they become popular, and about how the greatest edge in investing isn't faster information, it's better thinking. So, what happens next? Nobody knows. Wanbury may become one of India's most successful pharmaceutical turnaround stories. Oh, it may struggle to convert recovery into long-term compounding. The future has not yet been written, and that uncertainty is exactly what creates a market. If the outcome were already certain, there would be no opportunity left. Before we end, I want to leave you with one final thought. The next time you open an annual report, don't begin with the share price. Begin with the story. Ask, what problem does this company solve? Then ask, where does it sit in the value chain? Then ask, what industry forces are helping or hurting it? Then ask, has management allocated capital intelligently? Then ask, do the financial statements confirm the story? Then ask, what expectations has the market already priced in? And only after answering all those questions, look at the stock price. Because by then, you won't merely be looking at a ticker symbol. You'll be looking at a business. And perhaps that is the real purpose of studying companies. Not to predict tomorrow's share price, but to become a slightly better thinker than you were yesterday. Because markets reward many things: speed, information, patience, discipline. But over decades, they consistently reward one quality above all others: the ability to think independently. Wanbury may or may not become one of the defining turnaround stories of the next decade. Time will answer that. But if this journey has changed the way you analyze businesses, then regardless of what happens to Wanbury, the investment has already begun paying dividends. Because the greatest multibagger you will ever own is the quality of your own thinking. Thank you for watching.